Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our web event today. My name is Courtney Octor. I'm a business development manager at intiGrow, and I am joined by three subject matter experts. I'm joined by David Moon, who is the CEO at Arx Nimbus. I'm also joined by Stuart Richman, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Arx Nimbus, and Jim Skidmore, VP of the Solutions Group at intiGrow.
Thank you, Courtney.
You may want to go into presentation mode. There you go. Perfect. Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're located. This is Jim Skidmore from intiGrow. We're excited that you could join today. We have some very compelling topicality that will hopefully help you think more about how you make decisions for your cyber infrastructure and also your compliance requirements, and using actual data, which is not always a process that all of our clients use, to decide what their posture and policy and overall workflow should look like. On our agenda today, we will do a quick overview and desired outcomes discussion. We do invite everyone to provide chat questions. There are no bad questions, so please feel free to dive in. We'll talk a little about cyber insurance and backups for that. We will talk about the cyber frameworks that are employed these days by many global organizations, as well as even mid-market organizations. So those frameworks include things like SOC 2, NIST, MITRE, or whatever your kind of favorite one is. Stuart will then take us through some cyber risk profiles, and we'll look at some of these and look at financial impact, which is something that you rarely see in the market, especially if people are doing mergers and acquisitions or have a very strong reason for doing cyber rating of an organization. Then we'll talk a little about prioritization and planning and budgets and how that can work for you. I know that David and Stuart can drill down really well on kind of the low capability that many folks have these days, and potentially the high expected losses and the ramifications therein. Then we'll talk a little about remediation and audit results review and how you can impact that, as well as things that you might be able to go through and do with your internal or external solution integrator to remediate these issues. And this is a process that many people deploy. We'll talk about who some of those are and who some of their very relevant clients and big supporters of the technology are, including the U.S. Air Force, including NIST, and various others out there in the industry. And how to look at checklist for fixes or what solution adds you can make. Our first kind of question today for you is, are you certain that your insurance costs and burdens are accurate? Having done, consulting along these lines with customers around the US and around the world, I can tell you that pretty much everyone we've spoken to didn't have this exactly spot on. They filled out their questionnaires. They went through analyst feedback, and what's basically occurred is they were often overinsured or in many cases underinsured, not looking at really what the potential impact of the risks are. So if anybody would again like to reply in the chat or Q&A at any time, you can. That's definitely open to the audience. And then if you believe that your insurance costs are accurate, you may want to think to yourself, why is that the case and how am I verifying that? I think we can go on to the next one. Okay, thanks. Another question that we invite you to think about is, do you use a cybersecurity framework? Which one do you employ and why? MITRE obviously is a very federally focused best practice kind of grouping. NIST is used, for example, a lot more in private enterprise, but a lot of people will look to it as a benchmark for quality and for completeness, if you will. So that's something to think about. We'll provide some other framework thoughts, and we could talk a little about what we utilize with SOC 2, also with ISO 27001 and others that are methods that we deploy internally. And then we'll talk a little about, as we go on through the demonstration today, how are you determining your control values? Some folks are kind of doing that today and are rating themselves. Others aren't. There's no right or wrong answer to this question. We just want to show you how we think you can be more effective. People oftentimes will do internal team assessments and look at the validity and rating of how well that is working in your cyber policy management. Some folks use external consulting organizations to accomplish this objective. And I would say probably the lion's share of the folks that we work with have kind of a hybrid of this. They, will very much manage and use internal knowledge base to manage one part, but if there's something that they're working on or that they don't understand, they may reach out to kind of a subject matter organization for help in this realm. I know we do these in terms of zero trust maturity modeling and a number of other areas to kind of help people figure out how to get off the dime in some of these cases. And in many cases, a lot of the clients have this expertise and capability. So, all right, great. So best practice frameworks, there are many. If you're a defense contractor or if you are an organization closely tied to the Fed or a government entity, even state or federal or even local, DFARS is oftentimes adhered to and looked at as a standard. So that may be, one for you. Obviously, there's been a lot of guidance provided this year from the current administration in the US government, talking about controls, talking about zero trust, talking about other internal requirements for all agencies and for all organizations in the what I would call the supply chain of the Fed. There are other ones like CSF here that we're talking about. That's a lighter weight framework that's more subject to, to interpretation, but provides a little bit more flexibility and really relies on management reporting to kind of provide transparency in that capability. There's the Center for Internet Security now. If you are at a best practice organization that is quasi-government focused that the agencies use, kind of similar to NIST in the Fed space, if you will. So this is big. AICPA has been a standard that's been around for a long time. So if you're looking at SOC compliance there, that's fine. There's ISC, and a lot of people will look at ISC2 for SOC 2 compliance or other area. FFIEC is how we govern online transactions, especially credit card level transactions. You may see requirements there for funds transfer and credit card standards that are recurring. NIST SP 800-53 we know is widely used by many, especially private organizations, for best practice, and NIST has long been a best practice rating organization that people will follow. If you're going through process of building your own SOC. ISO 27001 is often used for that certification, and is often employs analysts to kind of help you go through and get that certification accomplished. Then there's a multitude of shared assessments you can cover. So standard information gathering is kind of a little bit of a different methodology, but definitely another relevant means to get there. Crow is another resource that can be used for successful framework development. So there are a lot of different ways. David, I don't know if you wanted to expound upon any of these, or if Arx Nimbus sees any additional kind of requirements. I would say on the intiGrow side, SOC 2, ISO 27001, high trust, DFARS, NIST are very standard for what we see.
Yeah, we see the same thing too, Jim. And I think, what's happening out there is that we've got a steady and strident march on the part of all of the regulators. And it's everything from SEC to US Treasury to Health and Human Services, if you're in healthcare, et cetera, towards getting objective, data-driven risk management in place. And so we'll get into this in a little bit here, but basically most of our risk management, let's just say it, historically in the cybersecurity space, and I say this as a former CISO myself, has been driven by professional opinion and expert judgment. And at some level, that's all we had. But these frameworks are now giving us the ability to drill much deeper, get into a much more standardized approach, and much like the accounting profession, which adopted generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, decades ago, we now are on our way to a similar kind of body of knowledge for cybersecurity. And it allows us to really kind of quantify and categorize these risks in a proper fashion.
I do want to mention too that if you're not using a framework today, where do you start? CSF is a great place to start, just because it's a
Yes.
lighter weight framework, and it's articulated in a way that the business entities can understand it, not just the technical teams. And that's by NIST. They also have NIST has 853, which is a more in-depth framework. The great thing about NIST is they do mapping across most of the frameworks. So say you have an international client or entities using ISO 27001, NIST has mapping rules to take all that input and convert it over to, say, a 853 framework.
And guys, I think also, if I'm a practitioner out there, the key message here is, what are the consequences if I don't have any of this in place? And of course, those are pretty extreme, because we've got things like litigation exposure, audit issues, both with internal audit and external auditors, as well as trying to do any kind of an M&A transaction where there's due diligence, that sort of thing. If we don't have frameworks in place, we're not really able to illustrate how the program, the cybersecurity program, matches up with accepted requirements, including for compliance purposes. So those are all things that, generally speaking, we want and that shareholders want. And that's why we focus on all of this.
Okay, great information. All right, fantastic. So I think what we'll do now, I'm going to pass the baton over to Stuart, and we'll go through a sample risk profile that you might see. Maybe not exactly, won't exactly be relevant to your organization, it's relevant to another, and then have Stuart kind of take us through the process and kind of the solution overview that Arx Nimbus employs in the market. So
great. So here's a sample cybersecurity risk profile. We like to look things as far as in financial terms, loss, near worst case loss scenarios. So in this case, we see this company has about a little over $63 million of expected loss if there was a security breach. Because of the controls they have in place, they've been able to remediate about 37 million. They have some insurance, so that may or may not cover a breach. And then they would be liable for the out-of-pocket self-insurance costs. We call it exposure of 18 million. So you can see in this example, the actual digital risk is broken out into known risk types, such as PII breach, denial of service, digital fraud. In this sample, digital fraud is quite high, so we'd want to drill into that. You could see that's identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. That's actually a CSF framework. And we could see where their capabilities are weak or a little stronger, such as recovers very bad, and expected loss related to the specific functions, as they're called. And once we gather all the data and run risk profiles, we like to work with our clients to figure out where they are in their digital risk journey based on a financial expected loss. So in this case, this company is about a 3, where 5 is optimized and perfect. It's impossible to get to 5 because there's always a new threat out there and new vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. But it gives a company a good guidance to get everyone in line, the business entities, the tech entities, as far as where they are. And then based on all this, what do we do next? Anything, David, you'd like to add on overall cybersecurity risk profiles?
No, just Stuart, if I might, a kind of an anecdote on the digital risk journey that you see there in kind of the lower right part of the screen. And that is, we've had this discussion with many companies, and it's probably a dozen of the Fortune 100 out of the last year as well. But it's never been the case where any organization that we've presented to has actually known where they are on this scale. And quite often there's a big distance in where certain senior management functions and individuals believe themselves to be versus where they actually are when you go through and you gather the data and determine that. And so it's really only, and all of what we do is against the context of, look, everything we do in cybersecurity is geared towards reducing risk. There is no other real outcome from cybersecurity. And so it's really kind of the one key measurement we have. And yet many times organizations are not measuring. They're not doing themselves a favor and understanding where they are. So without that kind of understanding at the digital risk journey level of, are we a 2.8? Are we a 4.2? Where are we in that range? That it's very difficult now for senior management to kind of come together and say, well, where is it that we need to be? Where is it we want to be? Where is it our shareholders and regulators are really encouraging us to be? And then and only then can you really determine how long are we willing to spend to get there? What kind of an effort are we willing to put forth? And what are we willing to invest to get there as well? Which is where working with organizations like intiGrow could come in, and obviously then formulating a plan. So this really is so fundamental that it provides the basis for the digital risk remediation plan, cybersecurity strategy, all of the associated initiatives with that. And that's really very important, to be on that solid foundation and have data as an understanding for things, just like a good physician who runs tests, does a diagnosis. Diagnosis is not based on their opinion, because we don't want it to be based on their opinion. We want it to be based on data. And the same thing holds true in cybersecurity.
Okay, excellent points. Yeah. All right, great. Yeah, as we obviously look here, we see a couple of orange and red areas that are, worth looking into. As not a real physician, but one who plays one in cybersecurity, I can definitely say those are places we would likely discuss these with our clients right off the bat. I think just to cover one more thing, we've worked with many organizations in the past who do cyber risk rating, but there is not a relative impact analysis that comes out this way that really provides actuarial level data, through scanning and other very scientific means to come out with what that impact truly looks like. And, they may do a cyber rating for merger, acquisition, et cetera, but that just comes out generically to, you're a 38, instead of, the relevant impact to the PII or the data that you're trying to protect, or the expected loss, for example, from an identity breach, what that impact is, truly looks like. And I think this is the elephant in the room that nobody really discusses in the industry that we're excited about. And I think that's one reason that we're very glad to take this approach. So just wanted to kind of get that out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, it looks like a lot of great people, a lot of people are saying an awful lot about you guys, right from NIST themselves, Matt Barrett, obviously clients as well, along with the U.S. Air Force, which we know personally takes a very deep look at vendors and rarely gives you, opinions on discussion points like we're having now. I don't know if you all wanted to comment on the perspectives and the media and market coverage that you're getting from people, but it's pretty impressive.
Well, thank you. This is very common sort of feedback. We see many times people are using things and have used sort of legacy solutions like risk register and other sorts of GRC type solutions. But quite often the issue there is that they tend to be populated by things that derived out of professional opinion or expert judgment. And of course, we're all human. We have biases. We bring those to the picture. We recently worked with a Fortune 25 company that had about 48,000 employees in 120 countries, and they had identified 66 risks for themselves across the entire enterprise. And someone recently told us, well, look, if they had 48,000 employees, they have at least 48,000 risks. And this is very important stuff. And so understanding this and not going just based on our own opinions is supremely important in getting to the right answers here.
Okay, great. No, that's awesome. And clearly global organizations are getting the message that this needs to go to another level. Again, the standard cyber rating methodology is insufficient really to understand the relative impact for board members, for investors, for officers and organizations that even in a lot of cases have personal liability involved. Mm-hmm. So, if we look at GDPR, if we look at a lot of the compliance areas right now that are impacting that's not just about us, it's about me. And I think that's something for folks to remember. Yep. So, but great information. Thank you. All right. I think we can kind of move along. All right. So these are other objective security risk management questions that a lot of people, and there are no bad answers again. And, oftentimes we'll do things with Chatham House rules with no recording. We are being recorded today, so we don't expect anybody to kind of open their kimono tremendously. But at the same time, these are considerations. And we find that a lot of folks are, I think David said it earlier, taking a little bit more of an opinion and, kind of subject matter, local expert view of, subsequent steps that they're taking in terms of their continuum. Many are not necessarily to this degree of granularity performing objective, risk management, surveying today, or I should say overall planning. So, we do know of some that are not doing anything other than what I would call opinion-based development. We know others that have some internal solutions, like I mentioned earlier, that are just looking at cyber rating at a high level, but don't have any context around what that relevant impact is. And those are, the internal solutions to do this. I really, honestly, having done this for a really long time, don't know how an internal solution would, really perform your cyber risk management unless you work for, an entity that does this for a living, right? And then there are commercial solutions. We've all, I think, seen who some of the other cyber rating risk management organizations are today, or maybe people are using kind of a hybrid of those two. But more often than not, when we see people that are using commercial solutions to set a benchmark, there is no relevant impact. There's only here's where we feel some risks are, but we don't know what would happen if, and what the impact to our organization or bottom line is. Some people don't really even understand if they have a production outage, what the cost per minute, cost per hour, et cetera, are to their business. So, yeah, I'm sorry. Can you just drop back one more time? So this also impacts prioritization and budget planning of overall security initiatives. So, David, are you seeing folks being, budget planning based on prioritization from your guys' perspective, or folks that are
Yes,
using the solution?
absolutely, we are, Jim. And we have seen anywhere from a 4 times cost recovery to upwards of a 10 times cost recovery in applying a data-driven risk management platform to a pre-existing cybersecurity strategy and program overall. Because here's what happens in practical usage, and that is we actually have clients today that are subscribed through 2024 that have been using the product for some number of years, and we're starting to see some pretty meaningful results out of that. And the reason is that if I've really kind of taken a look at what I'm doing, and I think and a lot of times we think of cybersecurity in kind of objective fashion. So I need a better SIM system. I need endpoint behavioral analytics. I need firewall policy controls. I need all of these are practical controls. And through that, we get certain vulnerabilities addressed. We get certain remediation in place. And it will always be the case that that's where a lot of the action is in cybersecurity. However, many times we're choosing those things and directing them without a lot of information about what we're going to get, what we're able to address, and how much we're able to reduce risk. And so this was the really crux of our work with Stratcom starting in 2017, which led up to the patent on the technology, the first patent. And that is to say, look, let's, rather than use our own judgment, let's get data from a variety of sources. So just like, again, using the physician example, there may be some blood tests, maybe some x-rays, maybe an MRI. Certainly, all of these things are data. And you can say, well, but where do you get that data? Well, you get it from the current condition of the individual. In our case, we get it from the current condition of the enterprise. And we also know, just like in medicine, how many incidents have occurred in the past, what the average is, and what the exposure to those incidents actually is, and what the consequences can be. So knowing that, and in fact, we work with databases all the way from the insurance claims in the United States, starting back in the 90s, when cyber insurance was really just a very emerging sort of thing, all the way through to things like, look, if I have a breach and I need to notify my customer base that were in that database, as is required by most state and federal law now, that they all have to be notified, then what is the cost of that? And it's not that complex to determine. The cost of a postage stamp is X. We've got Y number of records. We therefore need to satisfy that hard copy notification requirement and just do the multiplication, and there it is. So there are things in this that are not a huge mystery. There's a lot of data now in 2021 going into 22 that we didn't have in past decades. And that is things like actual losses. We track the actual equity loss, for example, in a 4-day trading period for public companies when they've done when they revealed that they've had a breach and they notified. And then things like, what are the typical scalings of remediation costs? recovery, et cetera. We have a very good profile on that from studying actual cases. And we normalize those to the size of the respective customer company that we're working with at that point. In addition, actuarial science, we work on a collaborative agreement with the Board of Regents at University of Illinois for their actuarial sciences department, and work on a lot of kind of leading edge models with them, including things like overall malpractice insurance, which is often a massive loss for an individual physician group, but a very low probability of that massive loss, and no individual physician has much of a history of those losses for themselves. So it's a little bit different, but society has determined how to apply actuarial science and understand the dynamics of risk. The regulators, as we saw earlier, have given us the frameworks in order to categorize where those risks are originating. And you say, well, who says that we have these risks? Who says that we have them in certain places? Well, NIST says, actuarial science says, the historical losses that have actually occurred to others, including patterns in our specific industry, and for companies of our size, say that there are certain patterns of losses. And so we take all of that and we put it together in a quantitative model that's been reviewed by professional actuaries as well as economists. And then the impact analysis that we utilize that says, how bad is it going to be? What is our maximum loss if we do experience a loss of this type? Was really developed at the University of Chicago, their economics department, where we spent many, many days with their teams and really refining that model. So we have today what Gartner labels as one of the most sophisticated solutions in this space, and something that is really kind of leading the charge on data-driven risk management. And then a final piece to this is going back to this, what are the consequences of not doing this? So you look at those first bullet points on both of these boxes, and there are plenty of people who are not really, believe it or not, doing anything in this area today. So it's sort of like driving around town with no GPS, and I like, why? Well, it's kind of a random journey and very inefficient in cases. And I'm sure we all have our own personal examples of that, but why do it? And to top that off, HHS, at least in the area of healthcare, is now providing a certain level of immunity from prosecution and litigation if you can show that you have in place an objective, data-driven risk management process. And otherwise, they're saying you're on your own. You're on your own, you're facing opposing counsel, unprotected, and that can be a very, very difficult thing. So, this is, and further to Jim's point, I mean, no one develops their own ERP, no one develops really their own CRM. You just get, these are sophisticated solutions in today's world. You just get what's best of breed, you apply it, put it in place, and then you go from there.
Okay, great. Well, that's very comprehensive. Yeah, I think to your point, when you're looking at those first two, all the prudent security leaders that we know these days and folks that have risk management outcomes, hanging over them, let's just say, if you're not checking your ego at the door, it's usually a very short run for folks that are just kind of, hanging out there making kind of ad hoc decisions on things. So point well taken. All right, very comprehensive. Thank you very much for taking us all the way through that. All right. I think, Stuart, we can go into the prioritize, plan, and budget part. I know you have some very specific use cases here. So
Yeah, so the way we look at how we budget and prioritize and plan, because there's so many cybersecurity initiatives across the board, where do you begin? How do you get the money you need to fund proper initiatives? So again, we look at it as far as capabilities and expected loss. So low capability, high expected loss. That's something you should address. So we could actually drill into anything and see what to do. So in this case, it looks like it's drilling into supply chain risk management. It's super low capability. It's 800,000 plus dollar loss. So this happens to be a CSF framework example. And here's the specific actions you could take to improve your posturing and continue to remediate risks, such as identify, prioritize, and assess your suppliers and partners, critical information systems, components, services using a cybersecurity chain risk assessment process. So again, this is what NIST is telling us to do, and rating ourselves on these different items. So that's how we look at it. So we could prove ROI by remediating certain risks, by improving our controls, and then go run another study and actually see our expected loss values decrease. So again, this is a CSF framework. Some international companies use
And
ISO.
Stuart, if I might just jump in, one kind of level set that's important to understand here is, look, every risk has an ongoing cost. Whether the risk actually materializes or not, the presence of the risk or the probability of that risk has an ongoing cost. So just any of us, just look at your car insurance, homeowners insurance, et cetera. Those premiums that we all pay are reflective of the carrying cost of that risk. And the reason is we've transferred some of those risks to commercial insurers. And the same thing holds true in cyber insurance. So if you think about it, if I have a possibility of $1 million loss, and that loss has an annual probability of say 10% a year, that's $100,000 cost that I have. Now, I can think about, well, maybe I don't have to pay attention to that. And, I get through the next year and the next year, and now I'm 3 years into this 10-year cycle and nothing's really happened. But eventually, if it actually is an event that happens on average every 10 years, it will catch up with me. And if I haven't funded either reserves against those losses or setting aside funds for, or gotten an insurance policy that will let me transfer the bulk of that, I'm going to have, one day I'm going to have a very, very bad day, which I can't recover from because I haven't properly funded that risk that's involved. So it's very important, just at a very fundamental level, as Stuart is showing here on the right-hand side of the screen, to understand these risks, what kind of costs they're creating. And this is actual costs. This is hard dollar actual cost. It's not going away. This is not the cost of what would happen if the event were to actually happen, which we address separately in our impact analysis.
Yeah. So in this case, the governance capability, 75%, not great, but high expected loss. So we'd want to drill into that and see if there's some low hanging fruit to improve that control. Another one, access control. This is an ongoing battle, obviously. So low capability, 61%, but a 2.7 million loss. So we'd want to drill into that, figure out what we could do to improve access control and come up with the budget again, execute against that budget, improve our controls, then run another study, and we would see our expected loss drop. And that we could actually then prove ROI back to the CFO, the board, go, yeah, we got $1 million budget, but we remediated $7 million in expected loss. So if you're doing this objectively today, it's a little harder without understanding the expected loss. Most companies could at least understand their capabilities so they could start there. But then if you have a bunch of capabilities that are 60%, which ones do you work on improving first? It's kind of a guess without understanding the expected loss based on historical data patterns and real live events that have occurred over time.
Interesting. It's funny. Yeah, if you could just hang on that one for a second. I think it's extremely relevant, just as an integrator, when we look at the relative impact, like the access control part, for example, which, carries a very high degree or a high expected loss value. For us to put an action plan together, that's because we're always doing requirements, looking at what the outcome needs to be and what to attack first, by simply putting oftentimes a reverse proxy in there and two-factor authentication, for example, or single sign-on, or, other controls to bolster that access control risk area. It's a very easy fix, right? And I would think the relative impact back through audit and back to the insurer would be, very easy to go back and say, okay, guys, this is where the rubber meets the road. We fixed this. We're tracking in a much better direction. The scans read better. We expect you to react along with us, right? And that's hard dollar savings. So, I can easily see where the outcome of this can generate ROI with each, let's just say each victim that you knock off the list here, to make life more simple and reduce operating costs year over year. So seems obvious to me. I don't know.
Yep.
Yeah, and this really provides the guidance for, where do we expect to get the most protection from the steps that are in front of us. And of course, we all know that if you went back like 15 years or so, the average cybersecurity shop was running maybe 20 or 30 solutions. Today, they're easily running in any company that's above like $500 million is running 300 to 400 solutions in many cases. And how do we really determine what we're getting the right ones? Where are we putting the best emphasis? Where should we be doing upgrades? That sort of thing. We really oftentimes don't use a lot of guidance at the enterprise level to determine that. So this really kind of allows us to have a roadmap and also to show senior management, look, we did this, we recovered these costs, we reduced these risks, here was the economic impact. And the returns here are massive just from investing in knocking down these exposures. And that's something, and we talk a lot about how cybersecurity is really a business function. It's not just a technology function, and we need to get more aligned with the business. This is really how we do it, because the business speaks the language of finance, and we have to be able to start speaking that down to a fairly granular level in cybersecurity so that we can show the results of what we're doing in actual business relevant and financial terms.
Okay, great. Yeah, I could definitely see if I were doing mergers and acquisitions and, in negotiation on some things, how, the valuation can change, easily based on some of this. And that's normally all we see in the cyber rating side, right? People will give you here's your score, here are some areas of challenge, but we can't equate what you'll be worth if you fix them, right? This gives us a much more intelligent way to kind of do that. So,
absolutely.
All right, great. All right, well, Stuart, thanks for kind of taking us through this. I think it becomes very clear how to develop kind of action plan and next steps. So,
yep.
All right, I think we can move onward. All right, do you want to talk about this? Because this is an actual customer case. 178 billion is not inconsequential. So
yeah,
Sorry,
Jim, this is just a very typical example, and I wish it were not, perhaps as dramatic as this, and yet we see this sort of thing all the time. So this was a company that had risk register implemented. They had it in place. They had paid KPMG, I believe it was, to come in and populate that risk register for them. But of course, a lot of that is, for those that have used that sort of technology, it's done through kind of a survey of senior management and a variety of other things. What do you think this risk would do if it were to materialize? Where do you think our top risks really are, et cetera? And again, unfortunately, that allows professional opinion and expert judgment to be injected into the picture, which can be a component of a proper risk management approach, but it can't be the sole source of information on risk, or we're really doing ourselves a disservice. So you can see it here. This is a very graphic example, and these are common differences. So this was an 87% delta between what the company thought its risks were in specifically the PII breach area versus what the data actually showed. And you say, well, what do you mean data? What are you talking about there? Well, you know, they had over 200 million HIPAA records in their possession. So that's a fair amount of exposure. It makes them fairly attractive to certain types of attack. And we do put a value on the assets that they're sitting on, but the value is based on what's the value to the attacker. And of course, many PII breach risks are triggered by a monetary incentive, and the attacker is looking to remarket these records. There's a market for everything, supply and demand. There's a market for stolen records, as we all know. And so we were able to determine that, feed that into a probability model, and then look at other instances where similar breaches had happened, and then scale that to the size of this organization. And again, we only look at a 4-day trading period for equity losses. But then there's also the incident response costs. And those are important to consider. And many people are working on models that don't factor in all of these costs in the entire loss envelope, if you will. And that is the fines, the fees, the sanctions, the PR costs of managing this sort of thing, litigation, and then all of the post-remediation work that has to happen to fix the vulnerabilities that were there that were unidentified previously. So through all of that, the delta here was really a belief on their part that they had about a $25 million loss that they could be facing in a PII breach incident. And instead, the data shows that it's something like 192 million. So a pretty big kind of, almost 10x kind of differential here. And when we finished this analysis, I think, which is very interesting, we said, well, now this is the data. You may agree with it or disagree with it. You certainly can use your previous number. You can use our new number, something in between. And, we're not telling you, but, your policy will dictate how you want to approach this now that you have this additional information that you did not have before. And they simply immediately said back to us, well, we're going to use your number. We've seen the analysis. We've seen how it works. We're going to use your number.
Oh yeah. Well, I would think there's potentially some other areas. I mean, if one of the most breached, kind of areas, and we certainly know that biopharma organizations do trials with healthcare organizations, and we've certainly seen, the clinical setting, the patient provider setting, get just absolutely decimated in the last, say, 36 months, right? Especially ransomware. And I assume there probably aren't ransomware costs for the $38 or $40 a desktop that, let's just say, we're aware of people that have paid that out as well, or in some cases up to 300. So, yeah. Yep. Yeah. Okay, great. Yep. I think you might be on mute, but okay. Yep. Yeah. But yeah, I think that those fees could be, I guess my point is they could be even underestimated in the case of a breach. And we've seen hard evidence of this. So.
Well, and especially you mentioned ransomware, Jim, ransomware asks are continually escalating.
Yep.
And many companies are surprised to learn certain factors. And one of them is, and whether any of us agree with this or not, but ransomware payments are an insurable item in today's world. And so you think about that, well, my cybersecurity policy would pay a ransomware payment. Well, in some cases, depending on the exclusions, and there are many, many exclusions in these cyber insurance policies, and not all of them have been tested in case law in court. So we don't know which ones will necessarily stand up or not as part of the challenge. But, the reality is that when there's sort of what we call the big meeting after the ransom is announced, then the realities come to bear. And there's something like we've got X hundreds of devices that have been locked up. We probably have to replace at least them, and we probably also have to replace many others throughout the enterprise because we don't know where the infection begins and ends. And so as a board member of ours who went through the Sony breach mentioned to us, how would you like to run a $5 billion motion picture studio on pencil and paper for 18 months?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, these kinds of things have a cost, and to do that, and the lost business, the lost efficiency, everything for the business. This is another reason why, or great illustration of, cybersecurity is actually a business matter, not just a technology matter. And so the insurer joins in when this big meeting happens and says, well, here's what our coverage is, et cetera. But at some point, the discussion turns to, well, look, what is our cost for replacing all of these systems, the downtime, the lost business, the outages, et cetera. You add that up and you start to look at it, and the numbers are staggering. And it's not uncommon. You could say, well, that could be the Sony example, for instance, was a $400 million charge against earnings. That's a substantial number for most businesses.
Oh, yeah.
And knowing that the ransom, if the ransom is substantially less than that, all of a sudden we get into this very unusual conversation that, again, a lot of companies have not anticipated they'd be in, which is, you know what, economically, it's an interesting choice, but we may just go ahead and pay the ransom.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's funny that you say that. On the healthcare side, we've actually, because it's a matter of life and death in some cases, we've seen people, kind of go forward and do the very same things only because, this person needs the operation, they need the meds, they need the treatment, they need the chemo, they need whatever it is that we all need, dialysis, it can be anything. If the EMR got hit or if any of the other applications got hit, we have no choice but to get that PII, back as quickly as we possibly can.
Exactly. And, so what happens is quite often the insurance provider will weigh in at that point and say, you know what, if you choose to pay the ransom, I think I'm in league with that, because otherwise I, as an insurer, are facing a virtually unlimited set of losses, which we don't know how high they would go, but we know exactly the amount that the bad guys are after in their ransom.
Yeah.
And that appears to be far less than what our exposure is if we don't pay the ransom. And so it's in many ways a sad state of affairs, but that is the actual calculation that we see companies making in this space.
Wow. No, that's amazing. And we're looking at a lot of unknowns going forward with the advent of quantum computing and how quickly it potentially can break RSA encryption and a lot of other things coming forward during the next decade.
Whole game changer.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting situation, but I think this data becomes ever more important at that point. So
absolutely. And the companies who understand where they are now in today's world can then start to see, when these additional threat vectors begin to emerge, what does that do to my overall risk exposure, my risk picture, and so on. And, then understand, well, what's the value of mitigating these things ahead of time to get out in front of it and being able to do a proposal internally that say, we have a $60 million problem that we can get ahead of right now for $1.2 million, let's say. And, what is there a reason why we would not do that? Because the business would do that and make that decision in almost every other area, whether it's supply chain, in marketing, in product quality issues, et cetera. And again, it's a business decision. Cybersecurity isn't fundamentally different. It's just we haven't been able to express these things in numbers up until now.
Yeah, no, it's we've all wrestled with that, right? Why do we need it? Because it's really important. So, yeah.
Right.
All right, Courtney, thanks for kind of moving us along. So this kind of begs some other cybersecurity questions that we, are seeking to address today. And these are things that, we're really asking all of our attendees and friends out there, to think about, right? Is your cybersecurity budget increasing, to David's point, or decreasing year over year? Most folks that we know, even with a 2.5%, adjusted, say maintenance agreement scenario with vendors, unless they're writing some things down for something that's coming out of production or something, but is generally increasing year over year. But we do see ways, obviously, here to kind of reduce that, as David and Stuart have been discussing here. Another question, obviously, is your security posture simpler or more complex than 2 years ago? Ironically, the technology is getting a bit better, but we are seeing people continually add and not necessarily take advantage of all the automation available to them, especially with cloud technologies, next-gen firewalls that can add substantial automation gains in other areas. But you should really think about, if it's not becoming simpler, are you taking advantage of what's available to you? Especially given a guidepost, kind of a console like Arx Nimbus is presenting here today that can help you get there. Another question is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with anybody who's planned their security policy out, a year or two or more. I don't know if David or Stuart, you've ever or recently seen any of that.
The 2 years we've seen, there are very few that have gone out to 3 years.
And it's more usually high level. We're going to implement single sign-on in 2 years. We got all these other things that we got to take care of first, right?
Right. Yeah. 3 years is crazy because the game changes, right? And we know within 18 months, we'll move from EDR to XDR and MDR, right? Collect all the metadata from an endpoint, or do whatever new technology thing is that we can do, and collect the information in a SOAR maybe to automate the response or anything else. So, okay. Yeah, I think this is a very good guidepost also to see if people are seeking to identify solutions that meet future needs, knowing what the risks are, if that makes sense. Because when you look at where the numbers truly are, obviously it tells you that you need to refocus on some things that you weren't really thinking you should primarily focus on.
Yeah, and Jim, if I can comment on that one too, that one of the things that we've seen that's really, really, really gratifying to us is that using this technology, people can actually roll out a future scenario. So they can, and this happens in a couple of different ways. One, where there is any kind of M&A activity, digital transformation, which a lot of people are doing, they're involved in right now, and cloud migration is another major one, but even implementing a new ERP, et cetera, those all change the threat surface fundamentally. So now we can start to roll forward, and with properly portraying revenue growth, other dynamics in the organization, maybe employee headcount, et cetera, we can now model those situations, and we can say, a year from now, 2 years from now, where does it look like we'll be on cybersecurity risk overall, and adjust the controls appropriately to see how to mitigate those increased exposures. And the other part of this, where we see companies really getting a lot of advantage from doing this, is kind of alternate budgetary proposals. So here's proposal A, here's proposal B. Maybe one requires more CapEx, one takes longer to implement, et cetera. But now you can actually make comparisons between the two. And so senior management can participate in evaluating and weighing those options, which really gets a much tighter conversation going between cybersecurity and the business.
Okay, well, great point. All right, well, obviously you brought up the cloud, just touched the last one for 2 seconds. We started off in a primarily public cloud world, then the advent of private clouds became very much more important for B2B. Now we see the world going to multi-cloud environment, which is definitely an overarching industry changing event, and it will change posture and policy within organizations. We brought up a couple things that are game changers, with quantum and some other technological areas that are going to change not only the face of the viable private and public sectors, but they're also going to change the face of the adversary. So that's really important to remember. So, all right, great. I think we can probably move on, Courtney, if that's okay, and kind of get ready to wrap up here. So intiGrow, just 2 seconds on what we do. As part of your review of this content today, we can help to do a complimentary impact valuation, which is really a combination of helping you to understand your assets more thoroughly and provide a proof of value from Arx Nimbus today, and have that service fully reviewed. We don't ask you to take us on faith. While we've put a lot of time and energy into this discussion, obviously the numbers speak for themselves, and ROI, reducing risk, reducing insurance premiums, and all of these things are real world events. We also get involved in a number of other assessment components for folks out there that are, as Stuart brought up, remediation activities as a result of the data feedback. We obviously can help folks take another step. For example, in that case, IAM readiness was real important, gaining an understanding of internal topology, and knowing what it meaningfully means to take a step to automate that whole process. We also talked about access control, which is involved in this, and how easy that is to kind of remediate. We do compliance health checks with folks as well. If they're looking for any specific issue, we often see attestation and access recertification being a very expensive, cumbersome process, which is required for nearly all the compliance areas, among various others. We're happy to kind of go through that health check too. We do zero trust maturity, as we were talking about, and we help people get onboarded, which is another recommendation, oftentimes from the Arx Nimbus portal here, and develop security posture based on what's currently utilized by an organization, and then ultimately policy. So that's just 2 seconds on kind of the intiGrow side. Stuart, David, it's been a pleasure chatting with you guys today. We're grateful for the opportunity. I guess, Courtney, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks everyone for joining us. If you have any questions or thoughts about, again, this really impactful solution that gives you an accurate profile of your organization, risk profile especially, please feel free to reach out to Stuart, David, Jim, or myself. We're happy to do more of a deeper dive as well. So feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn, and we're happy to go a little deeper with this. But thank you all. Thank you, David, Stuart, Jim, for your time today. And we look forward to connecting with you all. Have a great day.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.